Okay, is it true that the Quran calls the Jews apes, or any kind of derogatory statement or title of any kind? Is that, or is that just a claim? It's kind of like earlier you mentioned how the Christians really have a misconception of Muslims. Is this a similar type of situation?
That's a good question. No, the answer is that the Quran does call Jews apes, but people are not familiar with the context of is the Quran just saying that Jews are a bunch of animals? That's not what's going on at all. In fact, the Quran speaks very highly of the Jewish people. What's interesting is that the Quran really does not speak to Muhammad's genealogy, who he's from, who is he a descendant of. It's not spoken of, although there's conventional thought that he's a descendant of Ishmael, but it's not discussed. It means that the Quran generally is not at all, not like in the Christian Bible, it goes genealogies and so on. Quran is not interested in genealogies. But when it comes to the Jews, it is. And it refers to the Jews as the children of Jacob, or the Jews in many different ways, and speaks of them in very illustrious terms, that God had a special favor for them and so on. You'll find that in Al-Baqarah, which is the longest surah in the Quran. The Quran is 114 chapters. The longest of it is the chapter 2, Bakra, which means the cow, and it's a huge surah. It's 286 passages, and in verse 64 and 65, the Quran is condemning Jews who don't keep Shabbos. That's the context. You will find a cross reference that also in Surah 7, verse 166. So what's happening is Muhammad is saying to the Jews, you were shown favor. And he speaks about the Jewish people receiving the Torah at Mount Sinai, literally, and you're not keeping Shabbos, so then you are apes. And it's very, very interesting. In verse 60, I believe, of Surah 2, the text says that God made a special covenant with you, and He held a mountain on top of you. He held a mountain on top of you, and made this unique relation with you. And why aren't you keeping Shabbos? I mean, how different is that than the Christian Bible, where Paul is telling Jews not to keep Shabbos? How different? So Muhammad is saying, I mean, the Quran is saying that condemning Jews who don't keep Shabbos. I remember speaking to a Yemenite Jew who told me that in Yemen, there were no Christians in Yemen. They were never basically permitted in the country. But Jews flourished in Yemen for 2,500 years. And he said the rules were that if a Jew remained faithful to his religion and kept Shabbos and kept the Torah, they were the people of the book. They were completely protected and had a very, very good life. And Jews did very, very well in Islamic countries. We did better than Muslims did. Muslims might be killing each other, and unfortunately, tragically, we see this today. But actually, Jews flourished in the Islamic world. We were there before the advent of Islam, whether it was in what is today Iraq or in, the Jews did very, very well in North Africa. Terrific. Generally speaking, there are a few exceptions and so on, but because there was a few crazy groups, we have crazies. But it's interesting that I look at the tafsir, the Islamic commentaries on, like God held a mountain over you. That's what it says in the Quran, in Al-Baqarah. So the classical Islamic commentators are trying to figure out, what does that mean? He put a mountain on top of you. Like, what does that mean of the Jews? So it's very interesting. So as it turns out that it says this in the Talmud. The Gemara says, it's the Gemara in Shabbos, on Shabbat, the tractate Shabbat, Daf Pei Ches Omer Aleph, that's 88a. The Gemara says, so there's a verse in, if you go to Exodus chapter 19, verse 17. So in Exodus 19, verse 17, just to frame this is the chapter right before the Ten Commandments. God is about to, give to the Jewish people the Ten Commandments, which includes, keep the Sabbath, remember the Shabbos and so on, the sanctity of the Shabbos. So at the end of the passage, so in verse 19, in Exodus 19, verse 7, it's very interesting. Now, all the translators ended by saying, and the people stood at the foot of the mountain. Okay? Almost every translation runs that way. But the Hebrew doesn't say that. It says that the people were underneath the mountain. But no one translates it that way. And the Gemara says that when the Jewish people were ready to receive the Torah at Mount Sinai, so Kofaf, that Hashem Kofaleim Har Chagigis, that the Almighty put a mountain on top of the Jewish people, and He said, if you'll be Makabel the Torah, then Meitav, then it's good. If you accept the Torah, v'im lav, and if you don't, sham tehei kvuraschem. This will be your burial place. You'll be dead. I'll kill you. That means that I know I'm going to get a lot of questions on that, like where was their free will? That's beyond the scope of this question, so I don't want to get forlorn. But the key point is that the Jewish people, their only purpose is to serve God through the Torah. And therefore, in the Quran, as I said, you'll find it in chapter 2, you find chapter 7, Muhammad calls Jews who don't keep Shabbos, you have to just read it in context, calls them apes. Now, I'll tell you this, when I was a kid, if I don't know, didn't keep Shabbos, my father would call me worse than an ape. God only knows what would happen. I'd be in a lot of trouble. So it's an interesting contrast between the Quran and the Christian Bible. The Christian Bible is telling the Jews you don't have to eat kosher, you don't have to keep Shabbos, you don't have to do anything. You look at Mark chapter 7, verse 20 and 21, the making thing. You look at Acts with Peter seeing the sheet with unclean animals and go eat it. I mean, the Romans chapter 7, Paul is exhorting the Jews. You don't have to keep the law anymore. To the Jews, people think that Paul was telling non-Jews they don't have to keep the law. It's nonsense. Paul was telling non-Jews, he was telling that also to Jewish people. When he wrote the book of Romans, he was writing it to churches that he had not yet been to. It's different than other books. And he tells Jews, that's it. Your spouse died. It's a whole chapter dedicated to Jews not keeping Torah. So Paul is telling Jews not to keep Torah. So in the Quran, Muhammad says that you are apes, referring to Jews who are not keeping Shabbos. Now, there is among Islamic commentators, like, what does that exactly mean that they're apes? So, if in Arabic, it actually reads like they are apes. They're made into apes. But so some commentators say that they became apes, but the consensus is that no one became literally an ape. But it's basically saying that you're acting like an animal, you're acting like a pig. People say, why do you behave like a dog? Why do you act like a monkey? Why do you act like a pig? You're a pig. Look what you're doing. So that's what's being conveyed there. So so what I was saying before is in Yemen. If Jews kept Shabbos in Islamic countries, but in Yemen in particular, I know this firsthand, if they kept Shabbos, they were protected people of the book. That's how the Quran refers to Muslims. But if a Jew is found not keeping Shabbos, so then they were told they had to convert to Islam. As long as they remained faithful to the Torah, which by the way, Moses appears more frequently in the Quran than Muhammad by far. There are 70 passages in the Quran that are just talking about Moses. He's everywhere. The Torah is everywhere discussed. And Muhammad is exhorting the Jews to keep the Torah. But Jews who who were hypocrites who were not keeping the Torah, and those who were not keeping the covenant of Moses, and so on. So they were cursed. But what happens, tragically, what happened is that, so people who study the text understand the context, what's being said. Torah is full of very harsh criticism of the Jewish people when they sinned. Now, but it would happen that if you have a Muslim who hates Jews for whatever reason in history, they would abuse these texts, take them out of context in order to just to curse Jews. But that's not in line with the Quran. So, unfortunately, they would do that. There were, there are Christians who say, all kind of crazy things about Muslims. But the key is that these texts can be abused by those who have hate in their heart. But those who understand what the Torah is and understand the uniqueness of Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, our teacher, who is extolled throughout the Quran, so then they'll understand what these texts are about. There's another text, but I'm not going to go too far into this, but the text, always read the text in context and also understand what is the historical context of what we encounter in the Quran. So the Quran there is talking about Jews who don't keep Shabbos, and they're saying they're apes. Well, that's mild compared to what the Torah says happens to a Jew who doesn't keep Shabbos.